Yes, good morning, Miriam, and thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for everyone who's dialed in as well. I hope you enjoy it. First of all, let me explain the reason for asking the poll question. There's a lot of what I'm going to cover today is using English language and the different nuances of English language. So for those of you who have got less familiar with the use of English, you might struggle a little bit on some of the concepts. So I strongly urge you to go and read some of the background material because you can do that at your own pace and it's easier to understand. So I hope you follow it. First of all, I mean, I think critical thinking is a really important communication skill for everyone, in particular for testers though, because I think it can help you become more effective and I think it can help you therefore become more successful in your daily job and with your career. Critical thinking skills are actually taught in schools these days, so I think it's really important that we understand what they are and how we might be able to use them. They do take a lot of practice though, so we'll skim the surface a little bit to a degree on critical thinking. We'll introduce the concepts, but you need to do some practice, and I strongly urge you to go and do a bit more research on it as well if you're interested in the topic. Okay, so this is the structure of the talk that I'm going to give this morning. And the way we use language is ingrained in our style of communication, but also our culture and our situation as well. And it's frequently subconscious. And that's true for everyone. So as we go through and ask you to observe different patterns of speech behavior, it may or may not be conscious that other people are doing this. Some people use it for manipulation purposes, and I strongly recommend that you don't do that. But it's interesting to observe how other people get their meaning across. But as testers, we need clarity in our conversations with our colleagues and with the documents that we read. But remember, you have your own style too, so you need to be aware of that. And you may need to have to change that to get your messages across more accurately. It isn't easy, as I said before. It does take practice, but it does pay huge dividends, particularly in the world of software testing. It's made harder as some people are extremely good at using language to get their interpretation of the situation across and get that heard rather than an accurate and balanced representation, which is what, as testers, we're always striving to achieve. Okay, so why critical thinking then? Well, I think it's probably the biggest variable in communication is that we're all people. Within our testing community, we talk a lot, don't we, about getting our message across to developers and business stakeholders and so on. So this session is more to do with understanding the messages of others. So yes, be inquisitive. Yes, keep trying, but just let's talk about stupid questions for a moment. I think they're extremely powerful. One of the most powerful techniques that you can use in terms of understanding where people are coming from. So, for example, you might say, I know this is a really stupid question, but what does agile development mean in your context? I find myself asking that question quite a lot. And there's two reasons for asking this, really, or asking those kind of questions. One is to verify whether the person who is giving you information actually really understands it themselves, and frequently they don't. It's things that they've heard, and you're not trying to make them look small in front of other people. You're really trying to understand how much they really know. But the other reason for asking these questions is because other people around you may have been dying to ask that question too. So you can take the lead on this, and you quite often hear a sigh of relief. Oh my goodness, thank God you asked that question. I've been meaning to ask that for ages, and I don't know if you've experienced that, but I know I certainly have. Very powerful technique. So talk about being deceived quite a lot. It's not always intentional. Sometimes it is, but we can misinterpret, perhaps is another way of saying it, information. And we're dependent upon information as testers from so many different sources, aren't we? We've got people that we're dealing with, we've got documents, we've got the infrastructure, and we've got the software itself as well. And we depend and interact with this every day as part of our job. So let's pick these up individually then and look at people first. I think people's knowledge is really based on their experience and their opinions. And sometimes it's important for us to understand whether what they're saying is actually experience-based or just an opinion. If they know something is to be true, it's a fact to them. So they will promote what they're saying with the same degree of certainty, regardless of whether it's experience-based or opinion-based. But we need to kind of be aware of that, really. And in today's kind of global working environment, that's even more important because culture does play a big part in the messages that we convey and the messages that we understand. And we're people too, so it's easy for us to misunderstand as well. I think one thing to say is, or to recognize, is that everybody has at least two agendas. They have their personal career objective agenda, and they have their agenda which fits with their company that they happen to be working with or the situation they're working with. Now, when those align, that's great, and it's easier to not get miscommunication, but quite often they don't align. So recognizing that, I think, is quite difficult, and it's quite important. In terms of the artifacts themselves, I mean, I think we're all very familiar that requirements, for example, frequently have gaps. Frequently they're ambiguous, frequently they're not as concise or complete as they should be. And we strive to try and solve that problem, don't we? But the more ambiguous the requirement is, it sometimes works in the favour of IT, and I mean in the broadest sense, not just for developers or testers. But if you think about it, within IT, we want to continue to be busy, don't we? One way to continue to be busy is actually to misinterpret requirements. So we do need to be aware that that's going on in some situations as well. Okay, so let's have a look at infrastructure briefly. I don't think I've ever worked in a project where environments have actually been as stable or as complete as I've been told they are, or that I need them to be. It's quite a common problem, I think, for everyone. In fact, I could give an example here of a situation where, a few years ago now, a company I was working with wanted me to have a look at how effective their automation factory was, which was offshore. And they were running thousands of tests every night as part of a regression test pack. But they weren't getting many defects, and they weren't sure whether it was the fact that there was no bugs in the software, which they actually didn't think was true, or whether the tests were perhaps invalid in some way. So we did some sampling, and we ran those tests on a system or on an environment where the system under test wasn't even present and all the tests passed. So we do need to be careful that we understand what's actually there as opposed to what we're being told is there. Causal analysis, if any of you have been involved in causal analysis, shows quite often that the data is absolutely critical. It has to be representative to the type of tests that you're running. So the tests can be absolutely brilliant, but if the test data isn't representative of the data that's going to be in the live environment, they have limited value, and we need to be aware of that as well. And of course, once software co-resides with other software, it changes its behaviour, and we're all familiar with that as well, I think. So we think about software as an engineering practice, but I don't think we're anywhere near that discipline yet. I think we've got a long way to go. So critical thinking, it's definitely about having an open mind. I like to think of it as being a detective, really. And remember that the information that you're given is always only ever part of the story. There's always more that you can find out if you dig in the right way and ask the right questions. So, for example, as testers, we might do a static review of written documents, but that's not sufficient because it only tells you the quality of the document that's actually there, or the quality of the requirements there, or the completeness. It doesn't tell you what isn't there. So we can't get away without thinking. We have to do the thinking as well. And probably the most important thing is don't make any assumptions. Always qualify and verify your assumptions as much as you can. Okay. I don't use the word process very much, actually, but critical thinking is a process, and I think it's important that we understand every element of this process. Now, we won't have time this morning to go through each one of these elements in any detail. We'll pick up particularly on the techniques and have a closer look at those. But let's just think about the context of using those techniques. First of all, understanding where other people are coming from, what their hidden agendas might be, what their objectives might be, and then we have to evaluate the evidence and look for other things that actually help us verify whether what we're being told is accurate. And part of doing that is looking at opposing arguments, being able to read between the lines. And as I said, we're going to look at some of the techniques a little bit later. And then it's our job to reflect on the issues, really. And we are structured, typically, in our thinking. So we should be very, very good at this communication skill. When we're actually talking about drawing conclusions, we have to make sure that we're making sensible assumptions based on good evidence, not just assumptions based on our opinions or on past experience. They have to be relevant to today's situation. And then when we put our point of review across, it has to be in a clear and well-structured way that can convince others. And remember, back to those stupid questions again, those stupid questions can really help, particularly in the early part of the process where you're looking for where people are coming from and what they're trying to achieve. Remember to always make sure that you clearly state your conclusions, though, because they will help you justify your own plans if you need to have extra people or ask for more time, for example. So critical thinking will improve your analysis and increases your value contribution. I've got a second poll here, and I'll explain why I'm asking this question. I think in our daily jobs as testers, we frequently know that we're not being told accurate information. So this is just a gauge, really, how much this critical thinking skill is actually going to help you. If you're in the situation where you feel you have a good handle on everything that you're being told and you're always being told everything you need, I would, maybe you're working in a brilliant environment where everyone is very straightforward in their communication and very honest, and they always give you the big picture. But I would suggest that perhaps maybe you might be missing something. So even if you feel that you're being told everything you need to know, I would still do a little bit of a dig around. So interesting to see the results of this. Most of you are kind of in the middle, really. Sometimes you feel you're not being told everything. Occasionally you feel you're not being told everything. So critical thinking is a skill that's really going to help you. Okay, so back to the presentation. Right. I guess the higher the number, or the higher the amount you distrust, the more critical thinking skills are actually going to help you. And remember that most people go to work to do a good job. They don't go to work to try and deceive you. So like I said before, this is a subconscious activity. So we don't necessarily have to distrust everybody around us. So I wouldn't suggest that for a moment. But we do have to make sure that we're getting the whole story and not just part of it. So we're responsible for collecting all of this information. We might not make the decisions. In some instances, we'll certainly be asked for our opinion. But the information that we gather, other people use for decision making. So it's really important that we get a good balanced view and we get a complete view as we're possibly able to do. Okay. There are, having said that most people don't deliberately try and mislead, there was a situation I was in a few months ago, actually, where it was a fairly major program of work, and the reporting cycle was weekly, as it typically is. But the information from, say, close of the project on a Friday would be fed into a manager's meeting on the Monday, progress meeting, and it would be fed into a stakeholders meeting on the Wednesday. Now, the source of the information was the same, but the results and the way that the information was presented at both of those meetings was actually different. And some people attended both meetings, And so they asked me to try and get to the bottom of why, when it should be a single source of the truth, we were getting completely different representations of the data. And it was down to a particular individual in the project office who strongly believed that stakeholders really didn't like lumpy graphs. And so they took it upon themselves to smooth the information to make it more attractive to the eye, more visually representative, and more acceptable to the stakeholders. But they didn't realise in doing that they were actually completely misrepresenting the status of the project. So sometimes people do it for the right reasons, but and not for the right reasons for the project. Okay. Let's move on to having a look at the ways of using language. And I say, unfortunately, this time it's English, because English is open to multiple interpretations. It's whereas some languages are very precise, and you can think of them in black and white terms, if you like. Others are shades of grey, and English is definitely a shades of grey language, which makes interpreting what other people are saying quite difficult. But it also makes it quite easy for you to misinterpret the messages that you're trying to get across. So let's have a look at ways of using language, and we'll be familiar with all of these. So we can use language to give information about a fact. We can ask for information. We can indicate an emotional attitude. And this is something that we really need to account for, and we'll go into emotional language a little bit later on. We can indicate how a word is going to be used. We can ask how a word is going to be used, and we can get someone to carry out an action. So all of those uses of language are very familiar to us. There are a few others, though, as well. Poetry, jokes, quarrels, and to give a greeting, as we did at the beginning of this webinar. We're going to look more closely at 1 and 3, so that's giving information on a fact and environmental attitudes. But just a word about the use of humour to make a joke. It's quite tempting to use humour or to introduce humour to get your message across. Be very careful with the use of humour, particularly where people are coming from different cultures, because I think it can be very dangerous because it's so easy to misunderstand, and people can be insulted by something that you think is a humorous remark. And also turn that on its head. If you are insulted by something somebody said, ask them, was that supposed to be funny? Because maybe they think they're being funny, and you've taken it as an insult. So that works both ways, that one. So let's go on to the use of factual information versus emotional use of words. Now, if you take this as a very simple example, these two statements actually mean the same thing. My dog is a mixed breed, or your dog is a mongrel. But actually, the terms mean come across with a different emphasis. So although they're factually the same thing, the second statement actually indicates disapproval. And it could be taken as an insult. So that's emotional language rather than factual language. And although this is a very trivial example, if you compare it with terminology that might be used to describe mixed race, for example, 10 or 15 years ago, those examples are actually unacceptable in modern society today. So these things change. And as testers, I think it's important that we try and discard the emotion, both in the written communication and the verbal communication that we come across, and try and get to the facts. But because we're people, it's actually quite hard to discard emotion, and that's one of the things that we really need to practice. It's actually quite hard to put the emotions to one side and make sure that you focus on the facts. I found the best way of doing this, and I've done this in workshops where we've had a lot more time, is to take newspaper editorials or newspaper headlines. Actually, the Daily Mail, for those of you who are familiar with the Daily Mail, is a really good example. It has lots and lots of examples every day of emotional language. And try it as an experiment. Go through the paper and just pick out the headlines and get an impression of the messages that they're trying to convey to you. And if you only ever read the headlines, then you won't get a very good and balanced view. Now, we know that. And then go in and actually read the editorial and compare the content of the editorial on an article against the headline. Sometimes the headlines are actually giving completely the opposite message, emotional message, to the text of the editorial, and that's quite interesting. The other thing that's good to do to practice is to print off those articles and get a highlighter pen and go through and highlight all of the uses of emotional language that you see, and then just see what you're left with. And quite often you're not left with a great deal. You're left with a very few, maybe a third of the text that's not emotional language. That's my experience with some of the articles in the Daily Mail. But I'm sure other newspapers have similar similar articles that you can use as an example. But it's extremely enlightening, so I definitely suggest that you have a go at that. And emotional words are everywhere. And that's why this is step one in the process. Remember understanding the context of the person that's giving you the information and what their hidden agenda might be, what messages they're trying to get across. And it depends what side of the argument you're sitting on as to whether you perceive a word to be emotional or whether you perceive it to be factual. So in this example here, the adjective firm, you might say, I'm firm. Somebody else would see you as obstinate or even pig-headed. And that's how the shades of grey in English language actually comes across. Essentially, they mean the same thing, but they convey an increasing level of disapproval. And so when someone tells you you're pig-headed, take it as a compliment because you're standing firm on what you believe in. Perhaps that's one way of looking at it. And like I said, in some contexts, it just depends what side of the argument you're standing on. A typical example here would be freedom fighter versus terrorists. And that's something that we see every day in the news and we have to think about every day. Are you a freedom fighter or are you a terrorist? It really does depend on your perspective. So let's have a look at dishonest tricks in arguments, and we actually will do this as well. As we're going through this next little bit, give some thought to how you communicate. Can you recognize examples of you actually doing some of these tricks, or perhaps recognize examples of those around you actually playing these tricks? So explore it in your mind, and when you go back to work and you start to interact with people, watch out for some of these things. It can be a lot of fun, actually. Right. This is a very kind of popular dishonest trick, if you like, the all and some argument. So if we take all developers are poor testers, that might be something that we would actually say. We know it's not true. We can all think of a developer that's actually a really good tester. And all you have to do to counter this argument when someone plays this argument to you is to find one example of it not being true. And as soon as we find an example of it not being true, you can discount this argument. However, it's quite common for people to immediately come back and say, yes, but just because you found one instance that doesn't fit my rule or my vision of the world, all that means is that, that's the one exception that proves the rule. This is a term that's bandied around all the time. But we're testers, right? So if there's an exception, it isn't actually a rule. You can't prove it. It's false logic. It's not relevant. So we should make sure that we push back firm on that. It is a likely challenge you'll receive, but just think, prove really means test, and we're testers. So if we find one instance where a rule isn't true, that means it isn't a rule, and we must, I think, stand firm on that analysis. Okay. Whoops, I think I've just gone through two there. Apologies for that. Diversionary tactics. Now, those of you who've got children will know all about diversionary tactics because children are really, really good at finding all sorts of reasons why they shouldn't do what you want them to do, say it's bedtime, for example. And perhaps if you haven't got children, you've got pets. I have a dog, and when he doesn't want to come back and he's busy doing something else, he uses diversionary tactics too. What that means, though, is that we're kind of almost born with this as a natural instinct to kind of deploy diversionary tactics. And all you have to do is listen to politicians. They have never stopped deploying diversionary tactics since they were children. They never answer direct questions. They answer questions with questions. So observe politicians, and you will see instances of diversionary tactics all the time. So let's have a look at one of these examples. So you might say, I need 6 weeks to test or 8 weeks to test. And someone could come back as a diversionary tactic and says, oh, but the plan says you'll finish next Friday. Well, that's actually not relevant, is it? So we need to go back to the why did you need that certain amount of time to test? If those reasons and those objectives have changed, then maybe you could live with the fact that the plan says that you're going to finish on Friday, but they're not connected. They're irrelevant. It's an irrelevant assertion. And you need to be able to recognize that people are just trying to divert you away from what you know is the right thing to do. Let's have a look at some more diversionary tactics here. Personal attacks. Now, personal attacks are incredibly powerful. Again, politicians use this all the time, but people might use this to discredit your information or to discredit your opinion or your experience. So, you know, you always overestimate the amount of time you need to test. People could be saying that about you. And the reason it's very powerful is because the more people say these things, then the more it becomes true. It might not be true, of course, that's the case, might not be true at all, but it becomes kind of public knowledge that it's the truth. It's not fair, of course it's not fair, but we have to live with the fact that this might be happening. So be aware if people are saying these things about you and your behaviours and your information, because you will need to counter that. And you can only really counter it, not by counterattacking, I wouldn't recommend that, but by your behaviour matching up to your opinions and the messages you're trying to get across. And also be careful of people referring to things that you may not be aware of, and stupid questions come back to mind again here. So in this example, general systems theory is a meaningless statement, doesn't mean anything at all. But someone might sound as if they're agreeing with you. I say, well, yeah, according to general systems theory, you're absolutely correct. And you think, what's that? But you don't ask. So you say, thank you, yeah, that's great. And then they go on to say, oh, yeah, but, you know, latest research means that's a load of rubbish. So clearly, you know, you're wrong. So watch out for that one as well. So let's have a look at nitpicking. Now, nitpicking is often quoted, isn't it, as a skill that's necessary for testers, but I'm not really talking about that in this context. I've seen nitpicking diversionary tactics mostly deployed when a team is under a great deal of pressure. So, for example, in a review meeting or in a meeting where you're trying to make a decision as to whether you can go live or not with your application, people will pick on minor points in your argument or in your information, and they will keep on at them until they appear to be much more important than they really are. And this is one of the reasons that any data or statistics that we put forward need to be as accurate as possible, because as soon as someone spots that there's a mistake and there's an element that's wrong, then it actually discredits everything else that you say. So you have to keep putting back into context anything that they might pick out as being a problem or being something that's incorrect. So in the example here, if someone says that there's you're inaccurate in your information by even something as small as 1%, they say it often enough, everybody will remember wrong. They won't remember the 1%. So you need to be careful of that. And this is a ridiculous statement, isn't it? You can't be certain the system will fail in production. Nobody can ever be certain the system will fail in production. But you know what there is that's still to be left, and you should try and avoid following down those diversions. Just restate what the facts are. These are actually irrelevant assertions. Another argument that I hear a lot is the lesser of two evils argument. And usually the two evils aren't related, actually. But it's a tactic that's used to try and get the decision that somebody wants. So, for example, here we should stop testing because complete testing is impossible. Now, we all know that complete testing is impossible, but why did we start testing in the first place? Let's come back to that. What were the objectives? What was the coverage goals we set ourselves? What risks are we trying to mitigate? And let's bring the argument back to that again. We shouldn't stop testing just because we can't test everything. We all know that. But it's amazing how many times people actually use this as a kind of lesser of two evils argument. We might as well go live because we can't actually make sure we test everything anyway. And this last one, it's perfectly true that the software industry has a bad reputation, but does that mean that we have to kind of jump on that bandwagon and deliver software that we know hasn't actually been tested sufficiently well? I don't think so. A word on hidden agendas, I've mentioned that a little bit, haven't I, and laziness. Now, that's a strong word. I think it's people make decisions because to do something because doing something is better than doing nothing. So I think I mentioned earlier that I don't use the word process very much. One of the reasons I avoid talking about process improvement, for example, is that quite often people go down the road of, well, let's do some process improvement because they don't feel that tackling the bigger problems of changing our culture or changing the people that we've got are achievable. So we're going to do something. Let's have a look at the process. But in truth, if we don't actually bring people with us or we don't change the culture to match what we're trying to do, putting a new process in place isn't actually going to add any value at all, is it? And another example here is it's really difficult to get good people. We find finding the right testers, developers, whatever it is, finding really smart people is very, very difficult. Tell you what, let's abdicate responsibility for finding the right people to do the job and outsource instead. We'll give the problem to someone else. Now that is lazy because it assumes that the other company that you're giving this problem to are actually better at solving the problem than you are. And that's not necessarily true, is it? In fact, maybe they wouldn't spend as much time or put as much diligence into finding the people with the right skills that you would do yourselves. Okay. Selling a new idea. This is the last one of the tactics that we'll go through. We'll have a bit of fun with it. Say that you wanted to introduce a new idea and you wanted to get your message across with strong language, with good, concise language. So this is a nice simple 1, 2 plus 2 equals 4. We know that's true, don't we? We all know that's true. We went to school. It's the status quo. It's something we all believe in. But it might be promoted as a really corrupt idea. You're backward. You're live in the dark ages because you happen to believe this is true. And then the next thing is to actually put a crazy idea, a crazy over-the-top idea in place. So 2 plus 2 equals 6. Clearly, that's ridiculous. Are you prepared to kind of risk everything and go for something that's as crazy as that? And then the third option will suddenly become more reasonable. And maybe you'll start thinking that 2 plus 2 actually does equal 5. There's a lot of teaching, a lot of training that goes into the industry in terms of the middle ground. If you want someone to accept a particular argument, you stick it into the middle ground. It's actually even called the magnetic middle in a lot of training documentation. And it's certainly used in a lot of training for salespeople, for example. So be conscious that the middle one is the one everybody wants you to go for. Now, that might be a useful thing for you to do in terms of putting your arguments together, but be aware that other people are actually doing that to you too. So let's apply that to testing. Talented salesperson or a talented testing guru might want to sell you on the latest kind of testing idea. How might they do that? Well, let's, like I said, first thing to do is attack the status quo. Let's attack structured testing. Nobody does that anymore. That's really a Dark Ages type of concept. We don't do that, do we? Let's introduce something completely different, exploratory testing. Some people would see that as an over-the-top crazy idea. I'm not saying I do, but some people would say that. And then they would promote this middle ground of best practice and maybe even suggest process improvement to you. So be aware that people who are promoting best practice and process improvement might actually be doing that as a middle ground, easy option for you to go down. It might not actually help you, so you need to be very careful of that. Having said all of that, what you probably end up with is best practice for you. Your best practice would be a combination probably of structured testing and exploratory testing. Industry best practice doesn't really exist. There's good practices, you take them on board, and you make up your own mind as to what you do. Okay, so this topic as a sort of drawing to a close now, it's a quick run-through of some of the techniques of critical thinking. And like I said, we've really only scratched the surface today. I think it's a really, really rewarding skill to learn. There's a lot of work that you can do. There's a lot of experimenting and you can do. Try using your colleagues as a sounding board for your arguments. Try debating with your colleagues and seeing if you can deploy some of these dishonest tricks and practice them so that you recognize them more easily. Use what I said about the newspapers and observe politicians. And be careful, you know, do you use any of these techniques yourself? I'm not advocating that, but if you want to get your message across, you need to be aware that these critical thinking skills are useful to you as something that you might actually be able to deploy in your daily job. Now, I'll leave this last slide up here, which is the references, but that's the end of my talk, so thanks very much for listening, and hand back to EuroSTAR now and see if we've got any questions that you guys would like me to answer.
So if anybody has any questions for Susan, you can submit them now using the Q&A tab on your live meeting toolbar or press Alt and Q on your keyboard. Thank you, Susan, for your presentation today. It was very informative. Now, if we don't have any questions, and if you have one, if you think of one afterwards, you can email me, Miriam@EuroStarConferences.com, or submit them via Twitter with the hashtag ESConf, that's ESCONFS, and we will pass them on to Susan for you. Now, I see we have one question, Susan.
Okay.
Do we? Now, we just have a compliment from Kierton, a useful and informative talk.
Oh, thank you.
Then Chris Swain, how do we sell these ideas to uninterested testers, Susan?
Yeah, if people aren't open to learning, then I think we've got a problem. I think maybe actually using the newspaper example is a good way of actually introducing the topic to someone. Find something that you feel has got a lot of emotional language in it, and that will take it out of the workplace as well. So you're not using a real-life working example. It's something that's independent of that, if you like, and see if you can introduce the topic that way to them. And see if they can recognize emotional language themselves. Once people kind of get into this, they get a little bit hooked, and they'll start looking into things a little bit more. But if you've got people who aren't interested in learning, whether they're testers or developers, that's a different problem, I think.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Now we have another question from Justice. Firstly, he says, thank you for the good ideas and inspiration. His question is, programmers ask about functionality. Let me see now.
Okay, now I've got the question up in front of me as well. So,
Yeah.
shall I read it out? Programmers, as I ask about functionality, require from me to understand the system as good as they do. And it's impossible because I don't access information that they have. How could I put them into my position to understand my knowledge limitation? Okay. Just make sure I understand the question. So basically, I think, if I interpret the question correctly, you feel that perhaps you're being criticized because you don't understand the system as well as they do. And I think that's true. You can say, yeah, absolutely. You have your job, you understand the functionality, but explain to them what it is that you do and what value that you add. It's not a bad thing that you don't understand the system as well as they do. It's a different role. So you have to bring it back to the skills and the roles of the different disciplines, I think. There's another question here. Were these skills applicable mostly to testers? No, I don't. I think they're applicable to absolutely everybody, and which is why I think a lot of schools are actually introducing them into their curriculum now. So it's not just testers, but I do think that as testers, we have to be factual, critical, well-balanced, and structured in the information that we put across. And we have to be able to understand people from a whole host of different disciplines and a whole host of different forms, so document systems, that kind of thing. So it's extremely applicable to testers, but it's actually applicable to everybody. Okay. There's a question here from Walter Benavides. How do you keep and gather information if secrecy is a customer daily routine? So I guess if I interpret your question correctly, people don't want to talk to you, or is this a data security thing? If information is not available, then you can't actually comment on it. You can't critique things that you're not being told. So I find that I'm not quite sure I understand exactly the question on that. Perhaps you could come back and clarify that one for me a little bit more. Right, there's a question here from Andrea. Don't you think that to trigger change in testers actually requires a leader's vision regarding the direction of change? Test managers need to drive that change in a certain direction. How do you control that direction to get the most out of change? This is a general question about change management. I think where I'm coming from in terms of critical thinking skills is, as an individual, we get a lot of benefit out of understanding where other people are coming from as individuals and where information is coming from. Certainly it helps if you've got people around you, such as a test manager who is a bit visionary in this area and can actually introduce this topic and practice this topic with you. And talking about practice, there was a question earlier about how do you actually get testers engaged in this. Use them as a sounding board yourself and say, I've got an idea, let me run this past you. How do you feel about this? What do you think about it? So maybe not pose it as something that they need to put themselves out to learn, but actually engage them in supporting you with your learning, and then they might get interested that way. Okay. There's a question from Chris Swain. Are there workshops where we can explore these ideas further and get more practice? As I said on my kind of references slide, there's a huge amount of material out there on critical thinking, and if you do search on Google on critical thinking, you'll be inundated with stuff. So yes, there is. I mean, I actually run half-day workshops on this where we practice some of these things, so you're more than welcome to contact me directly and find out a little bit more that way. And I think we're just about running out of time, actually. I think I've covered most of the questions. There's a few thank you comments in here as well, so thanks very much for that. I hope you did find this topic useful. And I think we're just about there, actually. I think I've just about covered most things.
Okay, thank you, Susan. That was a great presentation this morning. And thanks to everybody for attending, and we hope to see you at our next EuroSTAR webinar, the details of which will be announced on our website soon. So if you have any further questions, you can also continue the conversation on Twitter by following us at ESConf. And finally, I'd like to remind you all that this webinar, it has been recorded, and we will email you once it is available in the EuroSTAR webinar archive. Thank you for listening. This webinar has now ended.